You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Here's your host, Ryan Argenta.
Welcome back to the Engage podcast. Here again with Rich Wheeler of the Negotiating Committee. And I know you've missed him, Shawn, Kellett, the chairman of the Scheduling Committee. We're going to talk Section 12, hours of service. We were just chatting before we recorded. Doesn't sound like a sexy section until you check your paycheck. And now Section 12 becomes important. Gentlemen, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here. Thanks, Ryan.
Happy to be here.
And thanks for the work. Let's dive in. Rich, hours of service.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the hours of service is kind of overlooked sometimes. It really contains all the important day-to-day limitations on how rotations are constructed and how your duty days are constructed. It has a number of limitations on the length of duty. It has the limitations on the length of your breaks in duty or layovers. And there's a lot of interlocking rules that go into play on Section 12. And when we dove into it, looking to make some improvements, we had a couple of goals. One is to have some more rigid, what we call industrial work rules over and above what the FARs provide, and then have a series of financial disincentives to drive rotation construction in the direction that we wanted it.
Okay, so we're talking quality of life improvements were a major concern for pilots. That's what we wanted out of this contract, and here they are. Let's start with red eyes, the dreaded red eye. So now it's defined. It's never been defined, which is crazy to me, but let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure. The red eye flight segment is one of those things that you would think would have a definition attached to it. It never was in the contract, and it is one of those things that we wanted to clean up. So we were able to establish some language that simply defines a red eye flight segment as an eastbound unaugmented flight segment that intrudes upon a pilot's wackle or that touches 0200 to 0359. And the wording here is a little odd. It says, as the aircraft flies through the air, and that came from our fatigue group. And they said, if that aircraft touches this time in whatever time zone it is, then that is a red eye. And that's what we were able to capture.
Okay, and I just want to say a wackle, window of circadian low.
That is correct. Late night hours, early morning hours, that's our normal sleep cycle. And so that just naturally you are probably less aware, less responsive, and that's just how we're wired.
Okay. And it looks like a pilot will not be scheduled for a deadhead or any flight segment prior to operating a red eye within the same FDP. So what would that look like?
Now, that would be if you were out there and doing a turn from LA up to Seattle and back to LA and then do a red eye. That would be a very long, uncomfortable day. And so what this language tries to do is put some restriction on that.
Okay. So you'd be able, for example, you'd be able to go LA to Seattle, back to LA, but you would not be able to operate that red eye unless you've had a break in duty.
Correct. There is one small cutout in this language if you are acclimated to the West Coast time zone, but once you've touched another time zone, that would not be permitted.
Okay. Tell me about shortened duty period limits. The maximum scheduled or rerouted duty period now is 13 hours.
Yeah, lots of improvements to sections 12. And as Rich said, this section is often overlooked because it's typically not super sexy, right? It's a lot of, here's how rotation should be built and published in the bid package, or will needs any type of rotation built post bid package. Here's how your pay is calculated before the pay and credit. Here's how the pay and credit's calculated after. And quite honestly, it's pretty complex. Even with scientific calculators, it's pretty tough to do. So what we did, and this is unarguably the largest step that we've taken to protect the pilots from the FAR limits, is we've increased the buffers essentially. So 12D1, what that limits is it says if your rotation's under table B or table C, it looks at your scheduled report time, whether you're acclimated or not. It looks at the number of flight segments you have, and then it tells you what your maximum duty day can be. In current book, not under the TA, but current book, there's a limitation of minus 30 minutes. So if that limit was 12 hours under table B, then they must build a rotation to no more than 11 and a half hours. Well, we have put in tighter bookends would be a good way to put that.
A hard
cap to we've reduced that window and then actually added a hard cap. So even if the FAR say you can fly 14 hours and that would be 13 and a half hours, well, now it's limited to 13 hours. And you're going to see other improvements as well, where current book, not the TA, but current book, if you have, let's say today you fly 2 operating segments and then it ends with a deadhead. So 3 segments under the current PWA. Well, if your duty period ends with a deadhead, that 3rd flight segment is not considered in the calculation of your total duty day under current book. Under the TA, it is. So what right now would be calculated at 2 flight segments is now going to be calculated at 3. And in many cases, that will reduce your overall table B or table C limits, and then 12D1 will further reduce that. So you can see collectively, it really does a good job of backing off the bookends of FAR 117.
Okay, so that considerably more restrictive is what we're talking about.
Exactly.
And that's a gain. Obviously, FRMS wouldn't apply here, but that's kind of outside.
Correct.
We're
No
used to
changes.
getting wrecked anyway.
Yeah, that's right. No change to FRMS. And table C, this is really more of domestic and not wide body, not augmented. And the other thing that we worked hard to get, nearly 4 years to get this one, was right now the FARs are pretty clear about a reserve pilot's combined reserve availability period, a short call, and your flight duty period. And there's limits on that. But what it doesn't do is, as we all know, is your flight duty period can end and then it can continue as a duty period with a deadhead. Well, the FARs are silent of that. So there could be pilots that were on duty in excess of 20 hours and beyond. They had a long combined short call plus a flight duty period. They block in from their last operating flight segment, and then they have a 3 or 4 hour deadhead at the end of that. Now we've really done a good job of reeling that in as well.
And that's referencing the RAP, right? The reserve availability period.
Correct.
And that's not to exceed 17 hours.
That's exactly
And that's
right.
a hard stop.
That's exactly right. And the wording is important to us, scheduling geeks. It's important. Pilots will notice that references the duty period now, which includes short call, any flight duty period, and a duty period. So any operating or deadhead flight segments in there. The FARs currently in the current contract only capture 2 of those 3. It captures the short call and your flight duty period, but this will capture the entire thing. So 17 hours seems like a stretch, but it really does a good job of putting bookends on which those bookends did not exist, and they currently don't. And like I said, there's been pilots, it's not uncommon to see a long reserve duty day where these guys and gals are working 20 hours plus.
Yep. Very good. I want to draw attention for our listeners, episode 4 and 5. So episode 4 is called Got Fatigue. This is scheduling rotations, quality of life. And then episode 5 is part 2 of that, scheduling rumors and myths. Go back, listen to those. Those are things that apply overall in terms of calling in fatigue, FAR 117, but it also gets into the nitty gritty on current book scheduling. And then compare it to this episode and the next one on scheduling, section 23, and you can really see some of the changes and improvements that have come online. So go back, episode 4 and 5. You'll hear Shawn's voice again. We've got Frank Whiting on there. And so back in terms of FDP extensions, that was an MOU that we negotiated during COVID, and that has been formalized now into the TA, right?
That's correct. And what this basically says is that any extension is purely voluntary on the part of the pilot. If you choose to extend, that is certainly your option. If you choose not to extend, that's it. You just simply say, no, I'm not willing to extend, and there's no paperwork involved. There's no pay penalty. It's simply walk away.
Okay.
And if I may just add clarification too, Ryan, that when we talk extension, nearly 100% of the pilots are very attuned to that, meaning your unextended flight duty period for the day, right? So what the FAR 117 table B or C limit says, you can go up to that, have zero obligation to go beyond that. We've also recently, we published a scheduling alert, and this is codified in the scheduling reference handbook. All of these products have been vetted through the company, where we have now placed those limits on 12D1. So there are limits on there now when you reach your 12D1 limit for the day, which it will always be shorter than the FAR 117 limit. You can actually walk away from those. What they'll see in that schedule alert, and it'll eventually be wrapped in the next version of the scheduling reference handbook, and this applies to all the new values that we've created, all the new fences or goalposts in the TA, that you can now, when you get up to your new industrial limit, which is significantly shorter than the table B or C limits, through coordination with the company, you are under no obligation to go beyond it. So as you can see, I'm being very hesitant to say extend, but you don't have to go beyond that. And we also updated our schedule alert that talks about fly now, grieve later, what you can and cannot walk away from. And this is included in there as well. So 2 great products that the pilots can use, but it's always a good reminder to say, certainly you're under no obligation to ever extend beyond your unextended table B or C limit, but also realize now you can, when you get to your 12D1 or 12D4A or 12D4B limits, you're under no obligation to go beyond that as well.
Very good. Let's get into some of the more fun stuff. The ADG carve out, an improvement to that, sit pay, extended duty pay, minimum calendar day pay. There's a lot of improvements here that I'm looking at. Let's start with the ADG carve out. This is if You're released between midnight and 01:59. That was kind of a freebie. You're not entitled to an extra ADG. But now we have something different.
Yeah, correct. One of our primary goals during this negotiation was to eliminate that carve out. And we were able to secure, if you release past midnight, you will receive 2 hours of pay, no credit. Something very important as we go through this for the listeners is the phrase that pays is above all other forms of pay. And you will see that repeated a number of times through these enhancements to the contract.
Yeah, let's say that again, because a lot of questions arise where there's pay and credit, and then there's pay and no credit. And something to hone in on is credit is built into a line construction window, it's built into your pickup limits, but pay and no credit is above the guarantee for a reserve pilot. It's in addition to any credit built into a rotation if you're a line holder. So pay no credit. And what was your jingle?
It's the phrase that pays.
The phrase that pays.
So we're talking about ADG carve out, the phrase that pays. It's 2 hours pay, no credit, which means for a reserve pilot, it's 2 hours above the guarantee. For anybody else, that's 2 hours above the rotation credit as paid. And Rich, you were going into an example of rotation.
Right. And, the important takeaway from the ADG carve out is it's release past midnight. So even if you get in at 11:31 or 11:35, you're releasing past midnight, that would trigger this pay treatment. Also, it's for any reason. If you are simply operating a late flight that's delayed and released past midnight.
Any pilot, any reason, 2
Anytime,
hours,
anywhere.
0 to 01:59. And then it's important to understand after 01:59, you still get the full ADG of 515.
That's correct.
Yeah. Very good.
What you're going to see is the theme throughout this is we tried to find a way to make it a deterrent for them to build better rotations. So we went in not necessarily trying to get the pilots more money. We went in trying to get better rotation.
Right?
Yeah.
However you
Very good.
define that. So in an absence of that, we said, okay, well, we're going to make it expensive for the company, for the optimizer, and in such a way that the optimizer is going to have a hard time figuring that out. And then we also wanted to make sure that, okay, if the pilot is still made to fly this rotation that's going to trip these pay treatments, we want to make sure every pilot's compensated. It's like under most instances, under the current contract, is that reserve pilot would receive no additional pay because it would be pay and credit. Actually, right now it wouldn't pay, but let's just pretend for the next 15 seconds it does. It'd be pay and credit, which simply means it's absorbed into that reserve pilot's rotation guarantee. And unless he or she fills up for the month, which very few do, then it's no additional pay. So what you're going to see is the theme throughout everything that Rich and I will talk about is we try to find a way so that if a pilot is put in this position, it's lucrative for all of them and it's not hidden and absorbed into the paid credit of that rotation.
Okay. Speaking of preventative measures, let's talk sit pay. Who likes to sit in the airport for 3+ hours waiting for their next flight?
Some people might now.
Yeah. Sit pay is, as Shawn mentioned, is a financial disincentive for these rotations to be constructed this way. This one works a little bit differently. This is actually based on the scheduled sit, and we did an analysis of this, and very often that you could be scheduled for a sit and you operate late into the sit, you might wind up actually with a shorter sit. And the goal of this is certainly to compensate a pilot for sitting around, but more so it was designed as a rotation construction feature that penalizes rotations that incorporate these sits. And so this is actually a scheduled number. So if you wind up during the first year of the agreement, it will be 1 minute pay, no credit for 2 minutes in excess of 3 hours. And then as we transition to January 1st, 2024, it's after 2 hours, you'll start receiving the 1 for 2. And again, this is pay, no credit. And again, like I said, the phrase that pays is in addition to all the forms of pay due.
So this is reserve pilots, regular pilots. If it's scheduled into a rotation, this is what you get. Now, if this just happens to happen due to a reroute or late operations or something, that's not what we're talking about here.
That's correct. The flip side of that, though, is let's say you were scheduled for a 3.5 hour sit that would normally pay and you operate late. Knows we've never done that. You will still get the full sit pay for the scheduled rotation.
Okay. Just one clarification. You said if you're rerouted, that is now essentially your new rotation. So if you're rerouted into a sit that you didn't have before, that's now over 3 hours, you're actually paid for that. So if you're rerouted into a sit, then it disincentivizes the optimizer. They use the optimizer for reroutes as well. Log sits on reroutes as well. So if you're rerouted into a long sit, you'll actually get paid for that sit as well.
Oh, great. Okay. And all these are stackable, right? They're compounding. So like these things can add up.
They can, yeah, they're all stackable.
Okay.
Everything is now stackable. And you're going to see some significant improvements in section 23 when we get there about things that are stackable. Current language, they're not stackable, current book, but they are stackable.
Okay. Rich, tell me about extended duty period pay.
This is one of those items that is flown under the radar. And we established the hard augmented duty period cap at 13 hours. That's, this is the hard cap that we wanted to establish. And with the extended duty period pay, we back that up with a financial disincentive for rotations that have duty periods longer than 10 hours. Basically, what happens for unaugmented duty periods at 10 hours and beyond, for every minute the pilot operates a duty period beyond 10 hours, they'll receive a minute of pay and no credit for every 1 hour. It's basically 1-to-1 payment for any duty period beyond 10 hours. And that is, again, over and above all other forms of pay. So if you go 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 50 minutes, it all is a 1-to-1. Anybody can open a bid packet today and have a rotation, multiple rotations, or a majority of the rotation or the bid packet, and you will see these long duty days past 10 hours. Every one of those will be paid a 1-to-1 beyond 10 hours. And if you're flying, that's on top. If you're sitting around, that's on top. It all adds up into, it could be a substantial sum by the end of the rotation.
Yeah, appearing too. The minimum calendar day now, that's something different.
Well, the mid-calendar day actually works a little bit differently. It is a surrogate for block time. And so this one is actually pay and credit. So this is operating just a little bit differently than some of the other pay treatments. The feedback that we've gotten is people don't like to sit on these 30-hour layovers and sit around and be uncompensated for doing that. But typically the optimizer stacks the duty into the other 2 days. So you can have a 7-hour day, sit around in Grand Rapids or Fargo or Minot or any such location, and then have a very long day the next day. And that gets to be a drag sometimes. And so what we did is we incorporated a minimum calendar day that acts as essentially a minimum block time. And so in the example I just gave, where you had a 7-hour block and then a 0 and then a 7-hour block, that's 14 hours of block time. Now on a 3-day trip, the ADG would override that to give you 1545. But in this case, now that the min calendar day would be put in place of the 0, it actually would pay 1630. And so you are getting compensated for your time for sitting around. But more importantly, it should drive the optimizer to evening out those days. So you're not in panic mode the first and last day.
And there's some good examples of this in one of the negotiators' notepads. We're going to put out scheduling alerts typically a month or two ahead whenever there's new items will be implemented.
Right.
And there'll be some examples in there as well. But yeah, overall, it's a disincentive. It's for them to level that out. We realize you're going to have higher block on both sides. But right now, instead of flying your tail off on A day and flying your tail off on C day and doing nothing in the middle,
Right.
hopefully that levels that out a little bit. And it's really to try to make the optimizer improve our quality of life on those rotations.
Yeah. Now, the important takeaway again on this one is it works a little bit differently than some of the other pay treatments in that it's pay and credit. It actually gets figured into the rotation construction. So it can get absorbed into some of those other guarantees like ADG. But with the implementation of the MCD, we're not aware of any other airline that has a combination of both a minimum calendar day and an ADG.
Okay. And just to clarify, this doesn't apply to international or ocean crossing flying. It would be a domestic trip with a 30-hour layover somewhere, right?
Yeah. The overall emphasis during this negotiating cycle was trying to correct the domestic rotations. And the best way we can do that is to focus on unaugmented. Because if you're augmented, you have a relief pilot while they're still fatiguing in their own right, in their own different way, that's totally different than unaugmented rotations.
And one thing that pilots are going to have to get used to as well is the rotations are going to look a little different now. So the rotations you'll see in the bid package, or the rotation that you still print out your rotation, or that you look at on my crew or high crew, whatever, will look a little bit different because the pay and credit most likely is going to be different than the actual total pay for that rotation. So we're working with a company right now. There'll be many examples out there, but this will be intuitive. So if a pilot wants to go through the bid package and he or she wants to shark shoot these trips that are, low pay and credit, but really high pay, then they'll be able to do that. So it'll be intuitive in there. And it will tell you each line item is going to be, you're getting paid for sits, you're getting paid for long duty days, so that'll be intuitive when they look at the rotations.
Okay. Very good. Yeah. We took actual rotations that are in the bid package now. We also took a reserve pilot who was actually called out on particular trips. We ran the pay treatments for the new TA, section 12 and 23, and there's drastic differences. I mean, the reserve pilot is a 737, I think it was Salt Lake, 737, and it goes from a 75-hour guarantee for reserve with all these pay treatments and the sits and everything else. It turned into like an 88-hour month. And the same thing for those line holders. Those rotations that are 1545 are now becoming 21, 22 hours.
I think that's going to become fairly commonplace, where you're going to see that the value, your line is going to be significantly lower than the overall pay for a month, or even the rotations. We're working with, like I said, we're working with the company right now to make sure the program is in place. And the 4 examples we got, I think the lowest difference was about 3.5 hours, 4 hours between what the current book would pay and what the new rules under section 12. And some of them were way higher than that.
Right.
And these are domestic rotations.
So let me ask you this, and you can speak to the section 12, 23 as a whole here. We've got the experts. Do you see any potential loopholes or downsides, or, it's like the company came up with the optimizer and we've combated the optimizer, but won't this spur some other creativity on their part?
Well, there's always the caveat with rotation construction and changing the parameters at any time. It's, we've heard the old, hey, if we had this rule, this rotation would pay this. But, chances are when those parameters get changed, rotation construction would change, because that's what the computer does. The computer's very good at working in the corners. And so the rotations can still be constructed that way based on their staffing restriction. They can certainly modify their construction rules to provide less pay, but then in most cases, or all cases, this is going to drive rotation construction in the direction that we wanted, which is shorter duty days, less sits, less sitting around being unproductive.
And I think if you were to look at, again, section 12 is not a sexy section, right? But if you to look at it holistically and look at the improvements we made, when you build on it and look at it as a collective effort, there are significant improvements, not only with pay, but with the overall work rules as well. Because what we try to do is, initially we went in 4 years ago, our position with the rotation construction committee tried to improve rotations back then was to increase credit. Well, since then, we've been able to dissect the optimizer and realize that if we just induced credit into a bunch of these rotations, the optimizer, its whole reason it exists is a zero-sum game. So it will make your life suck somewhere else in that rotation to zero sum. Okay, you added credit to this, that adds cost. We're going to make your life suck a little bit more somewhere else in that rotation to pay for that credit you just added. So after we were able to dissect the optimizer, realize all the different levers that we could pull and things like that, we decided that credit wasn't the right answer. Boxing the optimizer in was, because if you use this analogy at all the road shows, I think it's good. And though people can't see it, but if you envision it as a balloon and you squeeze it on one end, it's going to pop it up on the other, right? If you squeeze a balloon on both ends, it's going to pop up in the middle. And that's essentially what the optimizer does. So the only way to really contain it, the best way to contain it, is to create these rules and to create bookends. That was a completely boxed in no, but we have made a significant effort in starting to box us in with all these hard and fast rules. Anything I will tell you that it's going to drive, the cost is going to be significant too.
Okay. You're either getting paid for it or quality of life increase.
That's exactly right.
Very good. Rich Wheeler, a negotiating committee, Shawn Kellett, scheduling committee. This was section 12, hours of service, new perspective.
Thanks.
Thank you. Move on to the heavy hitters of section 23, scheduling. So stick with us on the Engaged podcast. This has been Engaged, the podcast for Delta pilots. Thanks for listening. My name is Ryan Argenta. Stay safe and keep the rubber on the road.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.